Good morning. I hate to break up y'all's little party. Good morning. Whenever y'all are ready. Hi, I'm Deb, and it's good to gather again this morning. You have no idea how close we were to canceling worship last night. I know. Had nothing to do with the fact that my sermon wasn't written. We had a minor issue in the building, which is not even worthy of conversation, and it got resolved about 2 minutes before I was going to send out a text alert canceling worship. So lucky for you. But here's the thing, and the reason I'm mentioning it. If we had canceled worship last night, would you have known? If you are not receiving text alerts from Woodside, then it would be really great for you to go to our website, woodsidechurch.net, and sign up to receive text alerts. This is not a political campaign where we send you 15 a day asking for money. This is for emergencies and special announcements and when the newsletter goes out every other week. So if you are inclined, if you'd like to know what's going on, that's the way to find out. That's the way to passively find out.
What if you don't text?
Well, I don't know what to tell you. Have someone call you. You could have a buddy system. If you don't text, you should make friends with someone who does, and they would tell you. The other ways that we would announce this are ways that you would have to go look for it. We would put it on the website, we would put it on Facebook. But the way that you can passively receive this news without having to do anything is to be on our text alert system. And really, if you don't text, then you should make a covenant with someone in the congregation who will call you when there's an announcement to be made, when something comes across that cannot wait. We do this for weather-related worship cancellations, for anything else that would cause an immediate urgent change in plans. And rarely for the newsletter, the people who are on the text alert system get the newsletter first by, 10 minutes. Whew. And then otherwise, it's for last minute or late breaking news or reminders. So seriously, we do this once every couple of weeks or so. It's not a harassment method for us. But that's how you would have known. And I wanted to remind you of that because we almost had to cancel last night, and you just never know when something's going to come up. There was Jay asked me this morning if I could announce that our discretionary fund continues to be a great source of need in the community. We are so pleased to be able continually to address needs that folks come to us with, and if you've read the annual report, you know the breadth and depth of those requests. I was going to wait till after worship, but then I thought, wouldn't it be great to make an announcement like this before the offering plates go around? So if you are inclined and able and would like to make a gift to the discretionary fund this morning, or at any time, please do that. Other news related to worship, I don't know, except here we are. I love our first song, I just have to tell you. Our last song is kind of fun to sing. I'm still catching on to the offering song. I hope you are too. Yeah, there it is. It's in really tiny print. The songs are designed to take up the amount of available space. So sometimes they're giant and sometimes they're really tiny. But we try to keep them familiar. What do we need to know about worship, Tom?
We're good.
We're good?
Should flow.
It should flow, he said. Okay. Then I just want to remind you, when we get to the moment of Holy Communion and the gifts come forward, that you are welcome at the table, whatever your faith background or theological leanings or, citizenship status, membership status, whatever it is, you are welcome at the table of grace. All you have to want is to participate. So come forward. We receive bread and dip it in the wine. The bread has no gluten. The wine has no alcohol. It is a gift intended, a meal intended for all of us. So please come and share. Otherwise, I don't know of any announcements that will be required to get us through worship together. So I would just remind you that whoever you are, wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome at Woodside Church. So please stand then, if you would, and join me in the call to worship. Christ is in our midst.
Open the doors to our hearts, minds, and spirits.
When God shows up, surprising things can happen.
We will lay down our burdens and set aside our distractions.
Here we receive good news. Nothing is too wonderful for God.
So let us laugh and sing, rest and listen, dance and praise. Let us worship God.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we greet you once again in this sacred space. We have come because we need to be reminded of your love and your expectations for our living. We are like the vine you planted, watered, and protected. We know in our hearts that we need and want your presence in our lives. So we come in prayer to listen for your word, to speak truth to our hearts, and reveal again your desires for us. Amen.
Let's worship together in our first song.
My heart is overflowing with gladness and with praise. The God who guards my going gives meaning to my days. Holy, the Rock of ages, known in word and deed, giving the victory, fulfilling my every need. The living God has spoken, earth answers with a song. Weapons of war are broken, the weak are feeling strong. Say we no longer hunger, crying out for bread. Our God restores to life and raises us from the dead. All who are poor and lowly will have a heavenly home. The humble and the holy shall surely know shalom. Now lives the needy from the ashes of despair. Neighbors, the outcast and the downtrodden everywhere. The power of compassion can turn the world around. The firm in faith will fashion gardens from barren ground. Echoes of joy are found resounding from the tomb. Cheerful, the childless woman lies hers within her womb. The one who once created and now sustains the earth, boldly anticipated, we too would bring to birth. Love conquers evil, setting all the captives free. Praise God for life beginning, life for eternity.
A reading from Genesis. After these events, the word of God came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. I will make your reward very great. Abram said, But my sovereign, my God, what good are these blessings to me so long as Sarai and I will die in disgrace? My only heir is a foreigner who lives in my household, Eliezer of Damascus. Since you have given me no offspring, Abram continued, an attendant in my house will be my heir. Then the word of God came to Abram and said, This person will not be your heir. Your heir will be of your own flesh and blood. Then God took Abram outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars if you can. As many as that you will have for descendants. Abram believed God, and God accounted it to Abram as righteousness. This ends the reading. A reading from Luke. Fear not, little flock, for it has pleased your Abba to give you the kingdom. Sell what you own and give the money to poor people. Make purses for yourselves that don't wear out, treasures that won't fail you in heaven, that thieves can't steal and moths can't destroy. For wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. Be dressed and ready, and keep your lamps lit. Be like the household staff awaiting the owner's return from a wedding, so that when the owner arrives and knocks, you'll open the door without delay. It will go well with those staff members whom the owner finds awake upon returning. I tell you the absolute truth. The owner will put on an apron, seat them at a table, and proceed to wait on them. Should the owner happen to come at midnight or before sunrise and find them prepared, it will go well with them. Understand this, no homeowner who knew when a thief was coming would have let the thief break in, so be on guard. The promised one will come when least expected. This ends the reading.
My favorite movie of 1984 was the same as everybody else's, Kramer versus Kramer. Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep were Ted and Joanna, a divorcing New York couple fighting over custody of their 6-year-old son, Billy. Joanna had left, moved to California, and Ted was learning to be a full-time dad. Then Joanna came back and sued for custody of Billy. Divorce, we know, can bring out the worst in people, and court battles can cause us to turn even the most insignificant details into mighty weapons. In one particularly painful courtroom scene, Ted's attorney is questioning Joanna about her intentions. She abandoned, left her family, so it's reasonable to wonder why anyone should believe that now she intends to stay. The attorney asks how long she will be in New York, and she says, permanently. And then, in a series of increasingly brutal questions, the attorney probes her definition of permanent. And finally, he announces that the most permanent thing she has ever done was to marry Ted, and that lasted just 7 years. So permanent must equal 7 years, at best. The attorney tells Joanna that she is an abject failure as a wife, as a mother, as a human being. When we think of things that we may consider permanent, we might mean all kinds of things. Maybe we think of eternity. The eternal is permanent. Maybe something is permanent if it will never end, ever. Or maybe we mean, I don't have a plan for what's next. Joanna moved to New York permanently, not eternally, but without an end date in mind, without a next step plotted out. We call wrinkle-free clothing permanent press, though we know that is not eternal. We talk about temp jobs versus permanent ones, even though folks will eventually move on in either one by retirement or in some other way. It may feel like an eternity, depending on the job, but it is not literal eternity, we know. When teachers put kids in their assigned seats on the first day of school, they may call these seats their permanent ones, but they don't intend them to be there forever, just until the end of the semester, or until there's a new seating chart, or until some folks start misbehaving and had to be separated, in which case there will likely be notes on their permanent record, a threat I feared throughout elementary school. And speaking of school and school supplies, even the magic markers we adored as children were not really permanent markers, as we call them. They did eventually wash off, but permanent was in comparison to the water-soluble ones that Mom preferred. Permanent, it turns out, is relative. Our readings today from Genesis and from Luke both seem to have a certain future orientation, a longevity that we count on. God tells Abraham he will be the beginning of a nation that will outnumber the stars. And that sounds like something huge that will never go away. Jesus tells stories, according to Luke, of a reign of God that we see in the future that we call eternal. We like permanence. It sounds reliable and trustworthy. And maybe we even think that we're good at it. Ted and Joanna barely made 7 years, but we know folks who managed to stay in a marriage for 60 or 70 years. In a Dear Abby letter a couple of decades ago, a woman wrote in asking for reassurance that America would always be here, which I found an odd thing to ask of an advice columnist. Abby responded, "Of course, we are the gold standard. This country is a sure thing. No worries, America is here to stay." And I wondered if someone calling herself Dear Abby or something similar may have written a similar reassurance to a worried resident of the Roman Empire sometime in the year 470. "This will never end. We are the ultimate in human civilization. No worries." And then it all falls apart. To look at the rapidly realigning nations of the world these days and think that somehow we alone will be immune is just arrogance. American exceptionalism is yet another national myth, and a dangerous one, since it leads to complacency. We are not that special. And as a nation, we are not guaranteed a forever. Yeah, we like to think things are permanent, which is part of why we cannot wrap our heads around climate science and the coming end of the world. Humans appeared on Earth some 300,000 years ago, and that is such a very long time, and why would anyone ever think it would be different? But things change. 5 times in the nearly 5 billion year history of the planet, some critical event, 5 times, some event, an asteroid or volcano or something, has caused a mass extinction, and life on the planet changed forever. The most recent one was when the dinosaurs died out, making space for mammals and eventually humans. But since nothing of that sort has happened in 66 million years, it seems like so much ancient history we don't even have to take seriously that it could ever happen again. But it can happen. It is happening. The world is changing. And just since the 1970s, not millions of years ago, but a couple decades ago, the world population has doubled, and the rate of species extinction has accelerated. Clearly, we are on a path toward nothing will ever be the same again. Consider this. 10,000 years ago, the population of this planet was 1% human and 99% wild animals. Now, the population is 1% wild animals and 32% human. The other 67%, farmed animals, livestock, which is changing the ecosystem in deadly ways. We are headed for something we have been unwilling to see coming. It is quite possible that this generation will be the last. I did not plan for the air conditioner to go off in that moment, but I appreciate the sudden silence. It is possible that this generation will be the last. We could do something about it, but we probably won't. So it strikes me that our definition of permanent is about to get tested in a fairly big way. And then I start to think about Abraham and God, about Jesus and the reign of God, and what all that means and what it suggests for us as people of faith. Back in March, this Genesis reading appeared in the lectionary as one of our Lenten stories. And I shared this quote from Walter Brueggemann, an extraordinary scholar of the Hebrew Scriptures. Writing about this moment in Abraham's life, Brueggemann said, "Abraham from this moment has now permitted God to be not a hypothesis about the future, but a voice around which his life is organized." God is eternal, always was, always will be. We believe that, we say. But I am having more and more trouble imagining a future beyond this generation. So when I think of God's promise of life, I do best to think of life now. We Christians find a whole lot of comfort in a life beyond this one, and I don't blame us. But we seem to just want to keep one foot in this life, while with the other foot we're holding the door open to the next one. In fact, some sects of Christianity simply look to the next world as permission to disregard this one altogether. Don't worry about climate change. It's all part of God's plan. I personally do best when I keep both my feet in this one. The reign of God has come among you, Jesus said. And even the ancient prophets called us to mend this world more than long for the next one. The day of God will come, they said, the year of God's favor. But it was not about a heaven far off so much as it was about a new political reality they dreamed of to comfort occupied people. The year of God's favor, here and now. And we get to help create that. God is not a hypothesis about the future, but the voice around which life is organized, said Brueggemann, which works way better for me. Maybe thinking about someone hoping to be the father of a great nation, it seems like we Americans are taught to think of George Washington, the father of our country, though I'm told he really did not want that title. Lately, perhaps we think of sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. He is now dead, but during his sinister and scandalous life, he dreamed, among other things, of a baby factory in New Mexico, from where he would begin seeding the whole world, the whole human race, with his DNA. He wanted to create a human strain based on himself. He called it transhumanism, which sounds so much more polite than eugenics. His issue was out-of-control ego, a mental illness he shared with at least one prominent friend of his who now runs our country. But Jeffrey Epstein is not Abraham, best I can tell. Abraham was not about ego. He was more about survival in a hostile world. So when I think of Abraham listening to God, hearing the promise of a great nation, it strikes me a little more like this. Imagine God as a kid, a really well-meaning kid, a little kid in a poor neighborhood, perhaps, a broken down apartment where the water keeps getting shut off, where roaches take over when the lights go out, and dinner is sometimes a little thin. But this kid works hard at school, maybe math, maybe a sport, and this kid is doing homework or practicing a lot, so much, so very much every day, and says to mom, one of these days, I'm going to buy you a house, a big house. And mom, that would be Abraham in the story, mom smiles that tired, skeptical smile and humors her beloved child when she says, without a lot of hope, yeah, that'd be great. God is promising a way out of the despair, though the promise is something that Abraham cannot really imagine. And frankly, Abraham has heard it before. A while ago, when God and Abraham first met, God promised to make Abraham then into a great nation, but that's been years ago. Abraham was 75 when God first promised this. And it would be a decade before Ishmael would come along, child of Abraham and Hagar, Sarah's slave. But Sarah would get jealous and Hagar would live a life on the margin inside the family, and it would be another 15 years before Isaac would arrive, Sarah's child with Abraham. So, of Abraham, eventually two great nations, according to the stories, one from Sarah, one from Hagar, but it took 25 years for just the first two kids. At the moment of today's reading, neither of those children has been yet conceived, and Abraham is hearing this promise again, and maybe he's smiling a skeptical, tired smile and saying, yeah, that'd be great, but without a lot of hope. And then, verse 6, something happens, and Abraham suddenly believes God's promise. I don't know what made Abraham hope, but I see the world's population consuming this planet, and I think we must have some kind of purpose here that does not include repopulating anything. How can we be future-oriented as Jesus invites, future-oriented as Abraham models? I'm unable to see life beyond this generation, but I'm also unwilling to assign the reign of God to some distant heaven. Then, where does that leave us? What's our role? What does the promise of God mean to us? So we have to look again at context. Jesus was preaching to occupied people in a politically volatile time. The stories of Abraham likely emerged over centuries leading up to the Babylonian exile of the 6th century before the Common Era, 600 years before Jesus. The purpose of both of these sets of stories, at least in part, was to form a people, to help a nation coalesce around a vision in the most difficult times. They were not so concerned with future then as with present, how to live, how to hope, how to be people in community. And for that model, for those stories, I am grateful. Because these are hard times. We need stories of hope and promise, but what we do not need are stories that help us kick the can down the road or shift attention away from the tremendous need right now for righteous community. Abraham believed the promise of God despite all evidence to the contrary. He lived his life breathing the air of God's promise that something else was possible. And we are invited to be inspired by that. So what are we to do? We turn again to Luke, where Jesus certainly lived a current mission in the shadow of a broader vision. According to Jesus, we are to be dressed for action and have our lamps lit. This week, I happened to notice my front yard. Vines and weeds and whatnot slowly taking over my front steps. And with the water line replacement having torn up the sidewalk, it does not look very welcoming at all. I really need to do yard work, and I will eventually. But all the vines made me think of Miss Havisham from Dickens' Great Expectations. If my middle school literature assignments have served me, she is the one who, in some post-breakup breakdown, lived in her wedding dress for years in a house being overtaken by vines and weeds in a room that was slowly succumbing to dust and cobwebs. That's my house. Only the outside. This story from Jesus is not about a vine-covered life waiting in a wedding gown for the future that may not arrive. When Jesus talks about a wedding banquet and tells folks to be dressed and ready, it's not a call to stand in the front entry waiting for a cab or fidgeting like little kids on a Sunday afternoon visit from Grandma, trying not to get our nice clothes wrinkled or dirty before Grandma actually arrives. We can instead imagine hiking boots and fanny packs or paint clothes and water bottles or sunscreen, bug spray, stuff for today, for an actual world that needs actual attention right now. One writer, in a blog called Left Behind and Loving It, suggests that Jesus intends function over fashion, a requirement that we put on our big boy, big girl pants, he says, for the task at hand. Although he was torn between a utility belt and a crash helmet, so maybe we should have both just in case. dressed for action, dressed and ready, Jesus says. Because we too live in a world that is in trouble. Climate crisis has to be addressed if we want to continue to inhabit the planet beyond the year 2050, which I will remind you is not that far away. But even if we resign ourselves to that being the end, we certainly have a responsibility to the people and creatures with whom we share this earth. This year, nearly 1 billion people lack a life-sustaining source of food. 2.5 billion people live in areas of drought or curtailed water supply. And 2/3 of the world's creatures are farmed animals raised for exploitation and slaughter, food for the wealthy, and yes, we are the wealthy. Animals which in the meantime are treated abysmally, not like part of creation, and which in the raising consume a disproportionate share of the world's food and water in order to feed the wealthy. And to farm these animals, we are clearing rainforests and wetlands, forever altering the balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our world and causing us to lose so many species whose habitats are disappearing. Beyond food and water, there are other problems. Around the world, more than 70 million people are refugees, displaced from home by war or the need for food or water or economic well-being. Nearly half the world's population lives on $2.50 a day. The wealthy, less than $2.50 a day. The wealthiest 20% consume nearly 80% of the world's resources. About half the world's people cannot access health care. More than 1.5 billion of us lack adequate housing, and genocide is happening in at least half a dozen countries because we have such a high capacity to turn even the most insignificant details into mighty weapons. Here in the U.S., 500,000 of us are homeless. We also own 400 million guns, causing 40,000 gun deaths every year. Racial violence is epidemic, along with crimes against women and Muslims and queer folks. Nearly 1/3 of us lack health care we can afford and count on. And in the president's trade war, 2 of our key exports are militarism and white supremacy. And the question for us in this so-called Christian nation, 3 questions. What vision of the world is compelling to us? What wardrobe do we need for the task that we face? And where do we find the energy to take all that on? You don't hear me preach so often on the writings of the Apostle Paul, really ever. But I remember this thing that he wrote in the letter to the Ephesians. Stand therefore and fasten the belt of truth around your waist, and put on the breastplate of righteousness. As shoes for your feet, put on whatever will make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. With all of these, take the shield of faith, with which you will be able to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Because like the people of Israel who told the stories of Abraham, and like Jesus, and like us, Paul lived in troubled times. Maybe we think we don't need a shield of faith, sword of the Spirit, or helmet of salvation, but surely we can agree that a belt of truth would be a great idea. And pretty good walking shoes to take us into the uncomfortable places, and glasses without blinders or rose-colored lenses to help us see reality, and a megaphone perhaps. And a crossbody bag would be good, vegan of course, filled with petitions and postcards plus subpoenas and a growing list of questions we intend to ask, and maybe fact sheets on the truths that we need to tell, and pencil and paper so we can write down the truth we learn along the way, and a journal for exploring new habits of consumption that help us share the world a bit more equitably. The world can be mended. The prophet said so, calling us to be repairers of the breach, restorers of streets to live in. Jewish people use the phrase tikkun olam, which means world repair. This world can be mended. Did you notice how both of our readings began today? God came to Abram in a vision and said, "Do not be afraid." Jesus said to the disciples, "Do not be afraid." It has been God's pleasure to give us the kingdom. The promise of God, the reign of God is here. Ours to live in, to live out, to share. So we gather for worship. My heart is overflowing, we sang to begin our worship. My heart is overflowing with gladness and with praise. The God who guards my going gives meaning to my days. Holy the Rock of Ages, known in word and deed. God still desires to be with us. Abraham, Jesus, Paul, us, living in troubled times and hoping to be better, trying to do better. God desires us to be with God. God wants to be with us. Still promises us the kingdom, but reminds us that the reign of God is here now. We dream of permanence, but nothing is permanent in our world. We are in the middle of the next mass extinction, invited to prevent the death of the planet as we now know it, the end of life as we now know it. Nothing is permanent, not even the world itself. But in the impermanence, in the meantime, we have a responsibility to creation and to our Creator, to exercise dominion rather than domination, to take care, to mend the world. Abraham, from this moment, has now permitted God to be not a hypothesis about the future, but a voice around which his life is organized. And I wonder, are we equally willing? Willing to breathe the air God promises that something else is possible? Are we equally willing? The good news is that our lack of imagination is not the final word. Our inability to envision does not undo the vision. So we gather. We gather for strength that comes from the community, from a holy meal. We gather to be reminded of the meaning of our days. We gather to have our wardrobes fitted. And then we go. We go with the love of God and with this promise that we are not alone, and that ultimately, when we fall into the arms of love. For today, that is the promise that I hear. Amen.
Please join me in our statement of faith. We are not alone. We live in God's world. We believe in God who has created and is creating, who has come in Jesus, the Word made flesh, to reconcile and make new, who works in us and others by the Spirit. We trust in God. We are called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to live with respect in creation, to love and serve others, to seek justice and resist evil, to proclaim Jesus, crucified and risen, our measures and our hope. In life, in death, in life beyond death, God is with us. We are not alone. Thanks be to God. Let us offer our prayers to God, saying, O God, giver of love, receive our prayer. O God, we praise the strength of your love. Where there is hunger, raise up your love. Where there is hurt and persecution, empower your love. O God, giver of love, receive our prayer. Where nations are angry and plot harm against one another, bring your love. Where a government does not seek the welfare of all its people, bring your love. Where power destroys what you have made, bring your love. O God, giver of love, receive our prayer. Where our fears keep us from offering aid to all the needy peoples, bring your love. Where there is division and jealousy, bring your love. O God, giver of love, receive our prayer. O God, increase our affection, increase our compassion, increase our joy. Heal those who are sick, those who are known only to you, and those we now name.
Brian Rose,
Mark Hope, Jason Washburn, Leanne Lindsay, Sue Jane, Erica, Hannah Nicklin, Liz Perry, the Mitchell, Thompson, Joseph Allen. For Bill and Gloria, Dorothy, Lindy, Michelle and Andrew, Karen, Catherine, Evelyn, Linda, Kathy, Mark, Betty, Tyler and Lita, Doug, Earl, Cliff, Jean, Laura, Sandra, Dot, Alex, Jenny, Don and Liz, Carrie, Greg, John, Melissa, John, Ashley, John, Jamie, Gabriel, Marion, Felicia, and the families of Sharon, David, and John and Tony.
Where there is pain, bring your love. O God, giver of love, receive our prayer. O God, we thank you for the power of divine love and for the presence of your love in one another. Make us holy, make us whole, and through us bring healing to your world. We ask in your most righteous name. Amen. People of God, we have come to that part of our worship when we are invited to respond with thanksgiving to God's provisions for us. We have an opportunity to participate with God in the care of God's people. Let our love of God lead us to generosity for the sake of those who need our help.
Have we to offer? What have we to share? Coins from the coffer, hearts filled with care. God will not falter, so let us dare. Lay it at the altar there. What have we to offer? What have we to bring? Love bright with laughter, hope that we can sing. Dreams of what we're after, promises of when. Lay it at the altar then. What have we to offer? What have we to give? Eyes that are wide open, lies that we won't live, truth that must be spoken, justice somehow. Lay it at the altar now. What have we
God, these are gifts, and bless our desire to participate with you in the building of your realm among us. Accept these gifts as a sign of our love for you and for our neighbors. Amen.
God be with you.
And also with you.
Let us offer our prayers of thanksgiving for this meal. God, you moved over the waters and created order from chaos. You dreamed of community and made a world sufficient for all. You rescued your people from slavery and walked with them through the desert, accompanying them as a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. You gave them dreams and visions of a new way of living, a way of sharing the bounty of the earth with all its people, all your people. And Jesus, you tried one more time to show us a way that is better than what we can imagine. And when he threatened the status quo, we killed him to assert our own power. But your power is greater, and you chose not to have his death be the end of the story. So we shared this meal. A meal Jesus told his followers to eat. A meal he said was his way of being with us in the struggle, in the quest for a mended world. As he broke bread and poured wine, he shared it with all and said, "Do this. Do this. Do this." And we do. To remember, but more than that, to live for just a moment in the communion of all that is possible. With this bread and cup today, make us again your holy people. Remind us that what has come before is nothing compared to what can be, that who we are is a delight to you and our gifts are valued and worth. Bless this bread and wine, and through it bless us, your people. Let us bear your light to the world and be part of your vision of peace. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. Come and eat. stand and pray with me? Bread, wine, community, these are your gifts to us, O God. Bless us through these, and through us, bless others. We give you thanks always. Amen.